Hey, fellow superhero cinephiles. Did you know that almost 30% of adults say they haven't read a book in the past year? The primary reason why is a lack of time. Well, Audible's here to help with the gift of found time. Thanks to Audible, you can listen to audiobooks like Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, or Slugfest, inside the epic 50-year battle between Marvel and DC. Read up on the history of superheroes in comics and movies with Grant Morrison's Super Gods. You can also check out Vanguard, my original superhero novel series, or try The Vril Agenda or The Adventures of Fortune McCall, both of which were written by our dearly departed host emeritus, Derek Ferguson. Whatever you're looking for, Audible has thousands of titles that you can consume while commuting, exercising, cooking, or just relaxing at home. And not only audiobooks, an Audible membership also gives you access to tons of content like podcasts, theatrical performances, and exclusive Audible originals that you won't find anywhere else. To give you a taste of what you can get, Audible has partnered with this show to provide listeners with a free 30-day trial. All you have to do is go to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod, and with your free trial, you get 1 free audiobook and 2 free Audible originals. In fact, you get to keep those titles even if you cancel before the trial is over. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod and start your free trial today.
I'm gonna bring this up again. It's $150 a piece. We each chip in. My cousin knows this guy who knows a publicist.
What are we gonna publicize, Roy? The fact that we get our butts kicked a lot?
Well, maybe if you didn't smack me in the face with a shovel every time we went out,
All right,
you'd have some more wins to brag about.
I'm sorry about that. I just have a tendency to lose my concentration when I've got a salad fork stuck in my rear end.
Oh, I get it. So your shovel in his face is my fault. Is
You
that
threw
it?
a spoon at the guy, Jeff.
Now, what was up with that?
Frightfully embarrassed about that. I thought it was a fork.
You're the master of cutlery. You can't throw a knife sometimes?
No, I
when someone's
can't.
trying to kill me?
You can't use a rake sometimes?
No, I'm the shovel.
Well, I'm the Blue Raja. I'm not stab man. I'm not knifey boy. I'm the Blue Raja.
You know, that's another thing.
What?
I mean, you could get a little bit of blue in the uniform somewhere.
Really?
I mean, you got green, there's like a little flowery thing happening, but there's like everything but.
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
If we could just step out of our literal minds for just one moment.
Hey, ooh, look what I'm doing. Look at that. I'm putting 150 right on the table. Who's in with me, huh?
I don't have 150 now, do I? If I did, I would plunder my mother's silverware.
It's a waste of money.
You know who doesn't think it's a waste of money? Little Mr. Captain Amazing.
Well, Captain, if we had a billionaire like Lance Hunt as our benefactor, yeah, we could spend 150.
That's because Lance Hunt is Captain Amazing.
Oh, don't
here we go.
start that again. Lance Hunt wears glasses. Captain Amazing doesn't wear glasses.
He takes them off when he transforms.
That doesn't make any sense. He wouldn't be able to see.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine. And today I got a new guest on who hosts a podcast of his own, which I've been on, I think, 3 times now, if I'm remembering correctly. And that's Michael Hale of the KMP Podcast. Mike, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks
always a
for
delight.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. It's been a while since we've had one of these chats. But before we jump into the movie today, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, like you said, my name is Michael Hale. My friend and we host our own material through a handle just called KMP Podcast, which is really ridiculously named because originally we called it the Connor Michael Podcast, but then I think one of us attached the word project to the end for some dumb reason. So we get it switched around all the time. So we just call it the KMP Podcast. We actually have, let me check to make sure that it actually works. KMP Podcast. Does it actually work? Yeah, knppodcast.com. I always forget that we have it. We just haven't used it that much. We're basically the most informal of informal podcasters, but we're always very glad to make the connections that we have. You included, actually, because you were one of the very first people that was very kind to be a guest when we were piloting some of the material, and I've been very glad to listen to your content in return. So it's been a very productive, beneficial relationship.
Yeah, it's been on. I think if I remember correctly, the first time was to talk about just writing and stuff like that, and then we did a crossover where we had posted with my other podcast, Japan on Film. We talked about the Twilight Samurai, and then last time I was on was the Final Fantasy VII remake.
Yes. Oh, so good.
Yeah.
And my background weirdly is it's usually actually more so my academic journey is bizarre because I did a lot of higher education material specific focusing on comic books, and then that wound up getting into my pre-dissertation doctoral material, and then now I actually teach at a school of choice high school here in Texas. And so weirdly, film specifically is not actually my thing. The stuff that is usually like anime related or comic books in like the physical sense. So this is a little outside my wheelhouse traditionally, and even though it's related to things that I love and talk about all the time. So in that regard, it's a very casual kind of fun thing to kind of jam about. So I was really glad when you asked for, volunteers. I was like, oh, hey, what's something you may have not talked about? This is a cool thing. And then immediately afterwards, I was like, why did I suggest that? There are other better things I could have suggested. Oh, well, it's still fun. Like it's not like it was a bad suggestion at all, I hope.
No, not at all. It was, and I like, especially since Derek's passing, he would always pick like these, these lesser known, kind of hidden in the, buried superhero movies. And he was really good at picking those things out. And since we've done the rotating guest format, one of the things I like to do on the show is I like to let the guests kind of choose their own, which movie they want to talk about. And it's been a lot more geared since that towards stuff that people are more familiar with. So it is nice to be able to have someone. So when you said, oh, let's do Mystery Men, I'm like, okay, that I forgot. I haven't thought about that movie in years. And I bet there's a lot of people who don't remember it or never even knew it existed. So I think that's exactly the kind of stuff that I want to get back to here, is kind of balance out the more popular stuff that everyone's seen with these more obscure movies.
Obscure is definitely a good word. Well, at least now it is. I think there was a time when we were probably younger that I think we are right at the right age where we would have grown up around in high school, thereabouts. So it would have been kind of a very funny thing to talk about. But after a certain age range, it kind of is going to drop real hard off everyone's radar.
Yeah.
And you're either going to have found it on Netflix or something by accident, or you grew up with it. So it's kind of it's a fun thing to talk about.
Yeah. So with that in mind, we are talking, the movie we are talking about, we've just been kind of dancing around, is Mystery Men, which came out in 1999. So like you said, it was, I think this was around the time when I started high school. It had to have been somewhere around there. And this was a superhero comedy film directed by Kinka Usher, his only film actually he ever directed. And with a pretty impressive cast, considering how obscure this movie is. You had Ben Stiller, Hank Azaria, William H. Macy, Greg Kinnear, Janeane Garofalo, Paul Rubens in a pre-movie theater exposure role. I assume so. I think Kel Mitchell, Jeffrey Rush was in this, Eddie Izzard, Claire Forlani, Tom Waits. They had really impressive cast.
It's kind of like, I don't know. That's for me, it's what's remained most charming about it is Eddie Izzard as a disco themed enforcer with a boa helping Jeffrey Rush try and melt the brains of everyone in the city is just the most ridiculous sentence you can probably say with a straight face. And Tom Waits, I don't want to say he's that obscure because I'm sure he's obviously very popular. I did not even know that was Tom Waits until I was looking up some stuff about it.
Same here. I saw his name in the credits. I'm like, wait, Tom Waits is in this movie? I know him from, as a musician primarily. So I look him up like, oh, that's what Tom Waits looks like.
Yeah. And Greg Kinnear is I feel like Greg Kinnear is the kind of person who should have been snagged for more popular superhero roles a long time ago. So the fact that this is the kind of role he got, I don't know. I just think it's got a lot of amusing stuff to chew on.
Yeah. Well, first, should probably talk about a little bit of what it comes from, because this is very loosely based on the Flaming Carrot comic book series, and there are a few of these characters in there who were these kind of like these minor superheroes, and I guess it was the Mike Richardson, publisher of Dark Horse Comics, he pitched the concept to Universal, and then so it's a weird thing to make a movie about, because they didn't even have a comic book of their own. They were supporting characters in this other comic. I don't know. Are you familiar at all with the flaming carrot origins of these characters?
So Flaming Carrots is kind of like, in my brain, it's the same category as stuff like The Tick. It's sort of like this. It's content that I know exists. I've seen it. I've heard other people talk about it. I never actually did a dive into actually reading any of it. So my knowledge is that it's kind of one of those pivotal things that glues a lot of other comic things together, like history for like the artists like Steranko or Ditko, or like people who are influenced by other people, and then they would go on to make other stuff. But as of my actual direct one-to-one knowledge, very, very little, other than obviously the guy with the giant carrot for a head.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I know it exists, and that's about it. I did not know until doing research for this episode that the Mystery Men came out of that. So that's how little I knew about this going in. And I think you would be forgiven for not even knowing that these had a comic book origins. And so, like, I saw this movie when it first came out. I'm not sure if I saw it in the theater, or if I just saw it on VHS after the fact, but I remember reading about it before it came out and thinking, oh, that seems interesting, a superhero comedy film, and then being really disappointed when I actually watched it the first time. Watching it again all these years later, I can appreciate it a little bit more, especially because I think, if I'm remembering correctly, most of the dialogue in this movie is ad-libbed. Most of it is improv, which I think is, and so when you realize that most of it is improv, it adds a whole new dimension. You realize it actually is pretty funny when they're pulling the stuff off the top of their heads.
Yeah, as opposed to just, I mean, it's I don't know if this is a good compliment to give an actor when it feels like what you're doing is prepared. And obviously someone's reaction to that will be good or bad. Like if you saw it originally and was like, this really isn't for me. But then in hindsight, you'd be like, oh, that wasn't canned. Hey, that was live? Okay, that's actually pretty good. Like it's an amusing kind of reaction. And I think with all those actors I don't want to say the word pedigree attached to Ben Stiller is a little weird sentence to say out loud for me. I think he knew, because in some of the stuff that I'd been reading up on, he had felt like he was going to be typecast in certain roles and was initially hesitant to do it. So I feel like he was playing really heavily. I don't want to say he was miming himself, but I think he knew what he wanted to do with the role. Like there's a line where he says, like, don't correct me, it sickens me. Like that line was a thing that my friends in high school, like it still has stuck with us. Like, don't correct me, it sickens me. So it's really funny to think that you came up with a line that is actually unintentionally funnier than you probably meant it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it still winds up getting quoted, but not in the same way as like, I don't know. I just think of people imitating like the Christian Bale Batman voice, we like justice.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
It's not going to inspire that kind of imitation as parody, but like in the same spirit of the attitude, like, I don't know. It's just, I can't explain it very well. It's just, I really appreciate that their very genuineness made the lines repeatable in a way that's very similar to the way they were kind of trying to deliver it. Like we're trying to be funny, but also make our little point.
Yeah. And Stiller, he was originally offered the part of the Blue Raja. And like you said, he was worried about being typecast as like because he had been kind of known for playing the kind of like the kind of nerdy guy at that point in his career. And then he decided to take on Mr. Furious. But one of the changes he wanted to make to it is he wanted to, because he was a lot more powerful in the original script. And so Stiller thought that was too boring. So the change he made was like, he has the least power. So he's the way the analogy used was, I'm the guy who started the band, but I'm also the one who's the least talented. And that really works. And this kind of like started that, because Stiller has done a few of these parts since then, right? He did, in Dodgeball, he had played like the villain in that, and he'd use like the same type of voice. And he's done this kind of, I know I've seen him do this kind of thing in other movies, a little bit in Tropic Thunder too. There was a little bit of that in there. And this is really the movie where he really kind of started that.
I mean, hold on, I'm literally forgetting that. I cannot believe I'm forgetting the name of where he plays the model. Oh my gosh.
Zoolander.
Zoolander. Okay, so I just mentally have always attached him to Zoolander because that's just such a big role for him that I knew him as when I was younger. And Zoolander came out in what year? Let me check on that. 2001.
Yeah.
So this seemed like it was kind of this phase where his comedy was kind of turning into, I think there were things he wanted to do that were going to, it's kind of weird that Mystery Men's role for him was not as iconic as Zoolander because I think he pushed himself into weirder Zoolander territory for that whole production. So this is kind of this weird area where him playing a kind of an asshole, like kind of an angry person who's just sort of a jerk, who's that friend who's like, hey, we all want to go left. I feel like going right. It's like, okay, good grief. Shut up, man. And I just think that's a weird kind of character that I don't recall him playing when he's supposed to be heroic. Because you mentioned his stint with Dodgeball, where he's like the villain. So it's just a weird energy for him to have, which is kind of why I think it's just, I won't say it's good. I'll just say it's really charming.
Yeah, I like him in this movie. I like this movie a lot more this time around, rewatching it, than I did the first time around. And Janeane Garofalo was the one who had actually persuaded Ben Stiller to get in, because Stiller was offered the chance to rewrite the script and even direct it, but he turned it all down. He said he didn't want to do it. And then Garofalo came on, and then she convinced him to do it. And Danny DeVito was actually in talks to direct it at one time, but it.
So I read that when a while back when we were trying to look at some of this stuff, and all I can think is that Danny DeVito, just even back in the 90s, must have just genuinely had this like Always Sunny in Philadelphia energy to him. Like there's things that he's probably known for doing, but he'd really rather just be doing weird stuff.
Yeah.
And I kind of almost wish that he had taken a whole, I don't know. So I'm of two minds on it. I could see, because King Usher was most famous, right, for doing like the Taco Bell dog like commercial, and it was almost, this movie is like his own, like you said, it's his only movie. Like it doesn't go anywhere. It's almost it's in this little perfect little bubble of, it doesn't have another person director's name on it. They didn't make a bunch of sequels to it. I mean, it was the late 90s, but it was still the 90s. It didn't become anything other than just what it was. So it's kind of like this little perfect little thing. I sometimes wish, though, like someone like Danny DeVito had gotten a hold of it and done more with it, perhaps.
Yeah,
Maybe that would have helped it be propelled forward. But hey, here we are. You know, it was made in 1999. It's this cute little thing. It's almost wonderful for what it was. But sometimes it's nice to be like, man, Danny DeVito would have been really cool. I don't know.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems with this film is it came out way too early. Like at this time, you know, the audience, I don't think was really prepared for live action superheroes in general, really. So doing a superhero parody at a time when there weren't really many superhero movies is kind of an odd choice.
Yes.
I mean, I think this movie would have worked a lot better if it had come out like in this era.
Well, I think the closest thing that exists to a movie even like it now is Guardians of the Galaxy. And it just, because it's that, okay, y'all are a bunch of weirdo clowns who aren't as successful as all the other heroes. You kind of just bumble around from point to point. You kind of succeed despite yourself a little bit, but you also have like a lot of really good heart and spirit. You all genuinely care for one another. But I also feel like Guardians works because you know where it fits in like a bigger Marvel tapestry. So it can kind of be comedy, and it still has that stuff in there to be like, hey, cool, you don't like the talking raccoon. First off, what's wrong with you? Second, but you'll at least get to know what an Infinity Stone is. This didn't have anything like that. So I feel like the people who like it, I think just have I personally think nostalgia is what has kept this film alive.
Well, I think keeping it alive is kind of an overstatement, because there's like, I didn't even realize that when you suggested this, I was wondering like, man, where am I going to find that damn movie? And then I found out it was on Netflix. I'm like, holy shit, this has been on Netflix the whole time. I never knew that.
Well, I guess I will cede that point. Keep Alive is a left on life support that is Netflix. Like,
yeah,
please, like
barely.
It's like it doesn't quite have the giant Bender fire breathing tomb saying remember me. But I think that's the beautiful fun part about its I really think it's cast and it's weird novelty. I think now, like you're mentioning, if this had come out now, I personally don't know how people would have responded. I don't know. Like, do you remember? Remember like it was that long ago. DC, in their strange attempt to make TV shows without actually using Batman, decided to make that comedy series about like the Gotham City tech company. Without,
I'd never actually seen it, but I remember hearing about it.
It feels like it would be something like that. Like someone would. But I also don't know, gosh, but none of these characters exist in anything. So I feel now our palette for superhero stuff is very geared towards one of two major companies, and that's it. And I think if it doesn't fit into that paradigm, I don't know how characters without an attached nostalgia history or mythos would really fare.
No, personally, I think it could work, even though it doesn't have any of those attachments, because I look at this movie and I see it like being the Spaceballs of the superhero movies. And because the reason Spaceballs works is because you have Star Wars to play off of.
True.
And so if this came out now, I think, you'd have the Avengers to play off, Justice League, all that kind of stuff. So people would, the audience would be more aware of what the jokes are doing as compared to when it came out, when all you really had was Batman, and you didn't even have a superhero teen movie at that point. I mean, the closest thing you had was the Justice League of America TV pilot that never aired, or the Generation X TV pilot that everybody hated. So there was nothing really to compare it to.
The strange grave of the 90s that is filled with weird off-brand superheroes, like the series Mask. Oh my gosh, The Cape. No, not The Cape. Sorry, not The Cape. Oh my gosh.
No, that was The Cape. The Cape was early 2000s.
Well, there was another one. Oh,
are you talking about Mantis?
Oh, sorry. Yes, Mantis. Yes, sorry, not Mask. Mantis. I mean, there were all sorts of weird shows. Like Darkman was kind of successful, sort of.
It was the first movie was great. I mean, and yes. Both Mantis and Darkman, both of those were Sam Raimi.
Yeah.
Although Raimi only did the original Mantis TV movie, which was more pulpish, and then when they did the TV show off of that, Raimi had no involvement in that, and that was when they went into more of like the weird, more of the. It was okay for what it was in the mid 90s. I remember really liking it when it was on the air, and then rewatching it a few years ago. And to its credit, I mean, it took the concept a lot more seriously than a lot of TV shows and movies did back then. Like if you look at, say, Lois and Clark, which going back and trying to watch that is like nails on a chalkboard.
I mean, it's also going to be hurt very badly by Dean Cain just being Dean Cain.
Yeah.
So now having to watch him do anything is like, you're not super at all. No, so this as a product of the 90s, it has this really great vibe where it fits into a niche that, like you were mentioning, no one was really doing anything with particularly. I mean, they would eventually, but then you're going to have to get through the early 2000s superheroes. And I think that was kind of a smorgasbord of, there was so much stuff that they're just throwing at the wall. Like, because that was Marvel's fire sale, wasn't it? Where they were just like, all our rights must go. Please buy them. Make whatever movies you want. Steal.
Well, in fact, I think if this movie came out just like maybe like 5 or 6 years later, I think it would have been more successful in the wake of all those adaptations. I think it would have, because you had because a lot of those were not really well received. So I think it would have definitely been a little bit more in place in that time period.
This movie, to me, has always retained the same bizarre energy as the City of Heroes MMO game. Like, it's so particularly, it's got that weird Gotham, like it's a dark city, but it's also very colorful. Like, the characters are just extremely eccentric. Like when your villain is Jeffrey Rush playing a guy named Casanova Frankenstein, whose bizarre gimmick is he has like a very lethal fingernail and like claw lasers. I really don't know like where you fit into the superhero paradigm, but I'm glad that they had their own weird little thing to do, because it wasn't an oppressively dark movie at all. It was very bright and happy, and the scenes when they juxtapose going back to the superhero auditions, like just the weird ideas, like son of pencil head, like it's cute, and I'm just glad. But they kept everything very bright, so the weird contrast between very bright suburbia and then very dark, like very bleak everything else was just that made that scene stand out. So when Janeane Garofalo shows up, like it's like, oh, okay, they're all just kind of chilling, just being regular people. They just happen to have very bizarre powers. It was just very delightful. It's a phrase I'm going to try not to repeat too much, but that is just kind of the big energy, because I think a lot of superhero films, if they're like, I sometimes think of like the Blade movies. Like the Blade movies are fun, but as you keep watching them, each one is different. I'll say that each one is very different for its energy. Like Blade 1 was the pilot, like there wasn't anything like that before. Blade 2 was, looking back on it, really Guillermo del Toro. Blade 3 was a thing that happened that no one should ever talk about again. But at the same time, each one of those things had a really cool identity to it, that if you liked Blade, cool. If you liked Batman, it had an identity to it. You may not like George Clooney as Batman, but it was a very iconic movie. Mystery Men is just so weird because even the things I want to compare it to, it's not trying to be those things at all. So when I mentioned like, oh, their city's really dark, kind of like Batman, except it's nothing like Batman. So I think it just has the benefit of it knew what it was playing against, while not being able to be defined fairly against any of those things at all. Like since you mentioned Batman, I'm trying to think, if someone liked Batman, would they even like Mystery Men? Was that maybe why it wasn't quite as popular? Like maybe no one just knew, were you supposed to laugh?
I think that was kind of the problem, because this came out in the wake of, because like back then in the late 90s, all you really had was Batman, basically. I mean, you had, and as far as the movies went, I mean, you had Spawn, and you had a few other ones here and there, but most of the 90s was just Batman stuff. If you thought superhero movies, you thought Batman, and that was it. And then you had, a few things on TV, like you had like Lois and Clark or Mantis, like we'd mentioned. And you had these other ones here and there, but mostly it was just, so like, yeah, if you're coming in the late 90s and you have no familiarity with superheroes and you watch this movie, I don't think you're going to get most of it. Because it just, it's just not, and that's why I say like this movie is definitely ahead of its time. Because if it had come out now, the audience would get it, I think, a little bit more, or at least they'd know where it was coming from. They know what's being spoofed.
So, in your return back into the movie, was there anything that surprised you as being like way more, like, was there anything that you remember not liking before that in hindsight you're now like, oh, this actually wasn't so bad? Like about it, like the characters or the plot or the way the puns landed?
Nothing. It's hard to. My memory of this is just like not really liking it when it first came out, or just thinking like it wasn't that funny. And watching it the second time around, like it wasn't laugh out loud funny. Like I didn't have any of those moments, but it was just more like, oh, that's cute, or oh, that's neat, or something like that. And it was mostly the performances. I think the thing I liked the best was Greg Kinnear's Captain Amazing. The fact that he's got all these sponsorships and he's a superhero who has no one to fight.
Yeah, they're like, no, you do too good a job. Like there is no crime. Like the idea that a superhero would be so. If no one has seen this movie, right? The premise is, while there are superheroes in the city, crime is basically, they have their equivalent of Captain America / Superman, who is heavily branded by corporate logos. He's very popular. He's got the whole like dual dynamic, like by day he's actually this lawyer, but by night he's a superhero. Like it's that very cliche, like all American superhero. Like Greg Kinnear is very handsome, so he's very blonde, he's very attractive, and in his ennui of not having anything to do, he frees his own arch enemy so that he can actually be popular, and so they can have this dynamic again. Well, the villain played, I believe this was like Jeffrey Rush's first actual role that he had done for U.S. audiences.
Yeah, this is his first American film.
Which is so wild to go back to relook at things for him, because I'm like, oh wow, in a few years he won't be famous for anything like this at all. He'll be famous for being, Captain Barbossa and all these other things. So he's in that odd bubble of, it's just funny to think, what were some of these people popular as at that time versus what will they become way popular for later. So I don't want to say that none of them were popular, because they absolutely were, unless you're somebody like Jeffrey Rush, who isn't as popular as you will be yet. So yeah, the idea that the main hero would free his own. You're fine.
No,
Would
go
like-
ahead. It's just my daughter's just making noises in the background.
Oh, our cat is.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about...
Our cat is tentatively planning if she wants to knock anything over. She's thinking about it though. She's thinking about it. She'll decide later. But no, it's just yeah, no, but yeah, when the superhero is actually really the impetus of his own villainy, it's even that's actually kind of atypical. Like, I mean, the guy that causes all the problems is literally your corporate branded capitalist superhero.
Yeah. I love the Lance Hunt Captain Amazing dual identity thing, because there's that scene I love that scene in the diner when they're talking and Mr. Furious is like, no, he's Lance Hunt is Captain Amazing. They're like, no, that's not possible. Lance Hunt wears glasses. Captain Amazing doesn't wear glasses. He wouldn't be able to see.
I mean, look, I don't know. Maybe it's just like the kind of humor that over the years, like the ridiculousness of it, I actually do like laugh quite heartily at some of this stuff. Like the part where Greg Kinnear, as this Captain Amazing, releases his own supervillain and is then captured by said supervillain because he's a dummy. And in the process, these main characters, right, mystery men, wind up trying to free him. And in the process of trying to free him, one of them it's always that thing where I always wind up forgetting.
Are you talking about Hank Azaria, the Blue Raja?
William H. Macy is talking to him, and he's like, by the way, do you know Lance Hunt? He's like, I'll tell you a secret. I am Lance Hunt. He's like, oh, no. And then he plays it off like a joke. He's like, I've always wanted to say that. No, of course it's not me. Like just seeing Macy's face and be like, I knew it. He's like, no, you're totally wrong. Like in that universe, those tropes and even playing into them as a gag is just that kind of thing that, I mean, I'm sure there's been decades and decades of stupid puns about it. How can anyone not tell Clark Kent is Superman? And, like Lois just says, have you not just take off his glasses? Can you not see it? But in that universe, that's not how it works. Like you're always supposed to just be like, no, of course it's not him. He slouches or he's clumsy. He couldn't possibly be Superman. So them taking those tropes, but played from a jerk like William H. Macy, like tricking or like being kind of mean to William H. Macy is just, that's kind of where the fun of it is he's like, what an asshole-ish thing to do. But oh look, and then of course obviously he is vaporized because of course he is. When your lead heroes accidentally vaporize the hero that they're trying to save. I remember that being the thing that I was like, oh, what? That's not supposed to happen in this at all.
Yeah. But the thing is, because Captain Amazing's such a dick that you don't really care when it happens to him.
Well, even in hindsight, the whole sequence with the toggles. So the mystery men are trying to free him, and the juxtaposition of trying to ask, like, whenever any character is like, hit the console and then activate the lever, like a character stopping saying, hey, well, wait a minute, could you back up and repeat that, please? Like that comedy of being like, this isn't the way this is supposed to go. And then him just starting to lose his temper more and more when they're not getting the toggles. She has this one line where she's like, could you please go back and tell me how many toggles are involved in this whole process, including my superfluous toggle? And then Ben Stiller being like, you call it toggles? Like you mean levers? Like, it's just a funny thing that I don't quite... The humor only works because it's dumb, small, little attention to detail things that I just think come across as being very cute. And it's like, they're going to take the time to argue about what a toggle is called. What is this movie even trying to do? And it's like, oh, it's just tropes. Like the one part, like the whole idea, if you think about it, if your father is murdered and you put his skull into a bowling ball, like on the face of it, that is the darkest possible thing you could ever do. But in this, it's kind of like, what? None of you have psychic floating bowling balls with your father's skull in them after Eddie Izzard murdered your father? Like, come on. Like, it's just... Eddie Izzard is my favorite part of that movie just because of how like utterly non-threatening he is, and yet at the same time is obviously very threatening. This is, I don't know, the very strange flamboyantness of their villains is just bizarre. Like it was a real choice to think, what kind of villains should we have? Well, one of them should be disco themed.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of this stuff comes from the comic and how much of it was just created for the movie. That would be interesting to go back and kind of look at, to see like how much of this stuff did they put into this script, how much of the stuff was something they got out of the original comics. But you mentioned we've been dancing around her. I think she actually deserves a lot of message. I think most of the heavy lifting in this movie is actually done by her, and that's Janeane Garofalo.
Yes.
Like she is, and they're all pretty good. Like the core, like I call them the core four of this team. Like you got Ben Stiller, Hank Azaria, William H. Macy, Janeane Garofalo. All of them are good in this movie. And then to a lesser extent, you've got Kel Mitchell, Paul Rubens, and Wes Studi, who weren't as impressive in my mind. Especially Paul Rubens just kind of got annoying at points, and I just was kind of done with him. But Janeane Garofalo is definitely the best one of the bunch. Like she is just on point in this movie throughout the entire thing, and she's the only one who seems like even a little bit competent.
Well, because she's got the genuinely good backstory. She's got the genuinely interesting power. She's got the genuinely like, hey, I'm hazarding a very risky guess because I'm sure there really is an actual answer. Would she be one of the first major like female superheroes? I mean, I'm trying to think of a female superhero that isn't Linda Carter or the 80s or the actress that played the 80s Supergirl. But I think in the 90s, I'm trying to think, because this came out 2 years before X-Men. A year or two before X-Men, so I think she would have beat them by a little bit. I'm trying to think of a genuinely like
you would have had Batgirl and Batman and Robin.
Oh, that is true.
But other than that, you're right. And also you probably quibble with the term major as well, but
yes. But in a at least somewhat heavily tentpole. Well, I'll say tentpole. That's the wrong word.
I mean, the only other one I could think of is you had like I mentioned, the Generation X TV movie, which is on my mind because I actually made arrangements to do that movie with some people soon. But yeah, that's I think the only other place, because you had Jubilee and Emma Frost and Buff in that one. So those would be the only other ones I think, other than Batgirl, and then you had the Bowler, and that would be it.
I just really appreciate, and I'm not trying to, because it's delightful. Like Ben Stiller's kind of jerkishness. Like Ben Stiller, Hank Azaria, and William H. Macy are all very extremes of different emotions. Like Ben Stiller is very clearly like gruff guy. Hank Azaria is timid guy. William H. Macy is earnest guy. But Janeane Garofalo, I feel like, just has really good energy, is just being herself. Like she's a very confident, tough character, but she doesn't really like push back on any of them emotionally. Like she's not played as a typecast against any one other character. She's not there for, like Ben Stiller to learn a lesson from. She's just this really cool character who just happens to exist right alongside the others who joined later than they did. And, kind of like the new band member alongside, some of the other characters. But I think kind of like you mentioned, like Paul Rubens, there was only one joke they wanted to do with him, and it outlasted itself after the first. Yeah. Sphinx, I feel like, was only meant to get the joke out of Ben Stiller, where he's like, let me guess, you're going to say Rage will become your master? He's like, I was going to say something a little different. Like, I think that training montage was what they wanted. They needed something for Ben Stiller to play against. But I think Janeane Garofalo was just this really great character. And again, she has a genuinely cool backstory for the kind of odd property that this stuff is. Like William H. Macy being like, I shovel well. Like her being like, my father was murdered by a group of by a disco supervillain, and his psychic skull inhabits my bowling ball and can fly and talks to me. Like, it's so great.
I mean, I think like, she's actually the one character who you could actually see in a more straightforward superhero thing. Because I know the idea of the bowling ball seems ridiculous, but in general, like that could actually be seen in a much more straight-laced superhero story. I think you wouldn't have to change much about her to make that work.
She could have been a mutant in Oh my gosh, not X-Force. The series that Fox had alongside Legion. They had another X.
Oh, The
series.
Gifted.
The Gifted. I feel like she could have been a character straight
Yeah.
out of The Gifted. Just
Yeah,
transplant
absolutely,
her as either Janeane Garofalo then or Janeane Garofalo now, and she would be perfectly fine in that universe. It's like, what's her power? Psychic. Oh, okay. Yep, cool.
And my favorite thing about her was, like, it's funny. The best interactions she has in this movie are with the bowling ball.
Yes.
I mean, like the scene when they're at the bar and she's like having this argument with her father psychically, and she's drinking the beer and she like gives him a look. Yeah, I'm drinking. So what?
Weird. I mean, it's. I don't want to dig too deep into how deep the pathos has to go for this. Well, you know, if your father was murdered and you've had to grow up with him as a voice in your head as a bowling ball, like you're gonna come across as like that crazy person. But her powers don't fit. I mean, I'm trying to actually recollect. We don't actually see Greg Kinnear do anything amazing. Like, her powers exist as a weight class outside of anything else that she has played against. I mean, you know, Hank Azaria's cutlery thing is bizarre, but it's kind of like, okay, he throws silverware. All right, sure.
But never knives, which is
Well, I appreciated their whole like, we don't use guns kind of stance. As obviously the villains who are like, no, we'll use guns. Like, we're a gang. We'll just blow you away. Like, was also very. It felt like that was also kind of one of those Batman things. Is no, superheroes don't use guns. Whatever. Punisher, like, that's not an angle that we would go to. But it was just her job of being that character makes it just so much more delightful. And I think that, again, the only one I feel really awkward about is Kel Mitchell, just because Invisible Boy it was just a weird way to play the character, but I know that psychologically kind of tied into like how his powers kind of work when you feel invisible. No one sees you, but then he gets the one moment where his powers like genuinely work, and I feel like he got a really good moment, whereas Paul Rubens just was Paul Rubens, and I feel they thought they were just happy to have him. It's like,
although, and this might be, you know, it's stupid to probably overthink a movie like this, but I did think it was weird that when he turns invisible, he apparently turns intangible too.
I mean, invisible to the field, tongue-tied, invisible to all earthly tangible factors. Sure, you're just sure, why not? It's not gonna be like Kevin Bacon, Invisible Man. Like, you could put paint over him and still see him. He's like literally just pure invisible, which could have been played for more interesting things in a different kind of movie. Like, if you like, you know, a combination of Nightcrawler and becomes invisible, like you become intangible as well. That could actually be really cool. But in this, it's just played for kind of like oh, hey, it's Kel from Kenan and Kel. Oh,
yeah. I did like his line when he meets when the trio go over to his house, and he goes like, "Dad, I'm gonna go up to my room with these three strange men."
So no, but everyone else, I feel like Hank Azaria is, so when he has the reason I also wind up thinking back to Guardians of the Galaxy is it's like Hank Azaria and Star-Lord have the same kind of speech where they're like, hey, look, we're a bunch of losers. We don't wind up, you know, we're not going to get respect.
Wait, isn't that William H. Macy who gives that speech?
Oh, sorry, did I say Hank Azaria? I meant William H. Macy. No, then he has like the egg salad sandwich, and he's
I
like,
love that, the egg salad sandwich thing.
Like, it's like, look, this is gonna kill me, and either we're gonna go save the world, or I'm gonna eat this sandwich, and it's not gonna matter because my wife is always telling me not to eat it. And I was like, that's like high dad energy. That's like, I just wish that in my brain, like, it's just the same energy, like with Chris Pratt being like, hey, we're a bunch of assholes, like we don't get it, like haha, like that same thing, but done in 1999 before that kind of a gimmick, but played with just straight total dad energy instead of like rebel kid energy, is very interesting to think what are other things that, you know, we've seen before or we'll see later that this movie kind of wound up doing first a little bit.
I like William H. Macy a lot in this, and especially the relationship with his wife, and just like how she's like oddly supportive of him, but at the same time critical too. Like he's like I shovel better than anyone else. She's like, you do, you are the greatest shoveler. And she just says it with such earnestness.
Actually, I come to think of it though, that is also another I will still always, in hindsight, over years of now having seen this movie, does have some problems from being still a product of the 90s, like Hank Azaria and his kind of accent calling himself like Blue Raja. I think in hindsight, we'll look at that and be like, okay, British man calling himself Blue Raja. Yikes, that's a little weird. The borderline, like kind of cringy metrosexualness, like they're playing into a certain type for like Casanova Frankenstein. Like it's that last gasp of like weird, hey, flamboyant people kind of have an odd energy kind of thing. But Hank Azaria, though, his mother giving him like the good silverware will always be like a really sweet kind of moment. Like they all have those cute, like I appreciate that this wasn't a thing where of all the tropes they took, they weren't keeping the but nobody knows who we really are, except for like Captain Amazing, because everyone else, like their families know who they are, like they love them, they're very supportive, they're like, you going out and doing that thing again? Yep, it's that time, it's our week to do like the rounds or whatever. Like it was very, I actually am trying to think, I can't think of many other things even lately. Well, no, I don't know. The Tony Stark thing kind of did try to burst that bubble of secret identity versus public, but that was also a very big Iron Man plot point for a long time too, was eventually people do know who he really is. I guess I just think of like Blue Beetle or like Miles Morales, where it's like, hey, well, heck no, just Blue Beetle. Like he has family and friends that like know who he is, and he's kind of like, that's part of the dynamic. I just always really like their dynamic where they wind up getting their support from their actual family members as well as from each other. It was just really good. And I actually am surprised that kind of thing hasn't been copied in other films.
I mean, I guess you could say you see it on the CW shows a lot, like on Flash and Arrow and Supergirl. Like all their family members are in on it, pretty much.
Was this a CW production before there was a CW? Was it UPN at this point in the 1990s? Had it become?
No, yeah. It was still the two separate networks, because it was the CW was birthed out of UPN and the WB. So, no, this interesting that this is, I don't know. There's being ahead of your time and being, a misunderstood prophet, and then there's when your prophet is Mystery Men. This is kind of very odd. I have always just thought that this was one of the, I hesitate to say this is a inoffensive superhero movie, because like, so for example, I teach, and a lot of my students are very divided and almost very territorial about like their superheroes. Like even obviously, I mean, it's not I think I've seen some of your tweets about it, so I will hazard a guess to say that your Zack Snyder energy, you're not his biggest fan for some of like the I like Snyder when he's not doing DC characters. Like I think Snyder is a great visionary. I think he's got a great visual style. I think he is a great director. He's not as good with story. He definitely needs but he's not the kind of guy who should be doing the types of characters that he keeps getting handed. Like he's the kind of guy who should be doing like The Question or like, he's doing this Star Wars type thing called Rebel Moon, which I am looking forward to seeing that. I think that's going to look awesome, but he should not be doing Superman and Batman is my whole thing.
I would agree. And I think that for better or worse, that content that he made has kind of created a very territorial kind of fan who's like, well, if you don't like this movie, then you must not like superheroes, like that kind of thing. This is more of this weird sort of, I can't think of anyone who would watch this and become very territorial about it, because it doesn't fit into any mythos. So you can't argue that it's gonna, as an indie IP, I can't even think now of a whole lot of things that are like this, because now most content will be Marvel or DC, and the energy that kind of goes with both. I keep saying energy, so I apologize. I get aware of my own repetitive words. Marvel is now, you either are really on board with what they're doing, or you're going to look at it as another movie in the capitalist cog machine here to make Disney money. Or DC is kind of like, another dark movie, trying to mine that Batman resources for all they're worth. Let's see if Pattinson will do good this year. I mean, this is the kind of thing where I recall more what superhero movies I think were really supposed to be like, where they were just there to be appreciated and enjoyed, and it didn't have a stake in the franchise wars, I guess. So as a trip down memory lane, I was very appreciative of this was just a really fun thing that doesn't inspire. I think if anyone likes it, they're just going to like it. If they don't like it, they're not going to like it for the face of what it is. Just like, oh, I just didn't find the jokes didn't land for me, or oh, I actually am not a Ben Stiller fan for some reason, but it would be free of the kind of corporate fingerprints that now kind of occupy a lot of conversations about movie properties in general.
Yeah, this is the kind of movie that you watch it and a week later you forget about it if nobody mentions it, because it is like when you mention this movie, I'm just like, oh yeah, I remember that. But it was like I hadn't thought about this movie in like 20 years. So
no, I think that I don't want to say that's it'd be maybe mean of me to say that's where all superhero films belong, is you watch them, you enjoy them, and then you make room in your hard drive for other material, and you delete all memories of it, but you had a good time doing it. I do think there is a case you made for longer lasting intellectual property that has a greater web of connectivity, which is what I think Marvel wasn't able, and even DC. Neither Marvel or DC really had a very good job creating long-lasting IPs that people except Batman. I'll say that, except Batman.
Right.
Batman is almost always a despite itself kind of thing. Like you had, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin.
Right, where they completely. It's almost like a reboot. Those two movies, like they're so divorced from Batman and Batman Returns that it's basically like a reboot. But yeah, you're right. Until. I mean, I guess a case could be made for X-Men, because that went on for a while before Disney bought them out. But even still, like, it wasn't really until the MCU that really kind of hit that, they kind of struck gold with that concept. And I think a big part of it, and I've mentioned this before, but it's the fact that Hollywood is great at the hero's journey story. Like, they understand that intimately. And so the first superhero movie fits perfectly into that. But when you get into the sequels, Hollywood doesn't know what to do, or at least they didn't. And then I think the MCU was the first one to hit on, no, we're just gonna, so we did the hero's journey in the first movie, and now in the other movies, they're going to be genre films that just happen to have superheroes in them.
And MCU clearly had some I think maybe they saw it as a feature, not a bug. They were like, who's the villain? It's just like the hero. Exactly like them. Yes, they could fight someone not like them. No, that's not the formula. Like the Marvel committee kind of idea that they had going on for a while. Do we keep our villains? No, we're not going to use them again. Kill them at the end of the first movie. Something like Mystery Men is also weird, because it does an origin story, but it doesn't do an origin story for them as their individual characters. It's almost like it's an Avengers movie, because they get the team together, but some of them were already a team before, and the other half of their members are independent. So it'd been weird if you had found out that, oh, you didn't know there was a movie before this with Ben Stiller, Henry H. Macy, and Hank Azaria. Like, if someone had told you didn't know they had their own movie before this, you could have maybe been like, oh, well, I haven't seen that one. Is that where these characters come from? And I think that was really quaint that they actually didn't bother giving all of them origin stories. They mixed and matched it. So they're like, yeah, as a team, this is their first movie. Some of the characters have never been superheroes before, but the idea that you call them like the core three had been a team, that they're kind of on the outs with each other, that they want to, they're trying to figure out what is it they want to do. Like Ben Stiller be like, look, I know a guy, just give me some money. We'll be able to push our game to the next level. We'll get ads. And Macy's like, what are you talking about? Like, terrible. Like, that they're already kind of like bumbling clowns. Even that is actually kind of not typical, because I think every superhero movie is always the origin of the whole team.
I mean, I'd say X-Men was the exception to that, because they were already a team, and then they brought in Wolverine and Rogue in that movie, and that was just basically their origin story. As like the first X-Men movie is basically just them meeting the X-Men.
That is true. I was trying to remember if they had actually done anything like, I think that Cyclops mentioned they had done some field duty, and then Xavier was like, yeah, but you've never done this before, because it was facing Magneto. Like, it was very clearly whatever it is they'd done before that must not have been worth mentioning, because their actual come together moment was such a good, yeah, that first movie, it should have, despite all its 90s issues, still so genuinely good. Like, gosh. So the idea that this kind of came out a little bit before is, a trip down memory lane of watching this and then watching X-Men would give you two very, very different takes on what superhero films were. What some groups thought that it would be, which is just, hey, you watch it, you forget about it, it's kind of enjoyable, you have a really good cast, and then, it's gonna do as well as it does. And then I do not know personally. I mean, do you have any idea, like, when they made the X-Men movies or movie, did Singer, or was there plans to have always done multiple, or did they just kind of wing it and the first one happened to land really well and then they went, let's try to keep this going, or were they always planning on it being a franchise?
No, my understanding is that it was, I think Singer had signed on. I think they had signed on for multiple films, but it was always just kind of like an option for multiple films. If I'm remembering correctly, I don't know if it wasn't. It certainly wasn't the thing that they knew there was going to be like a trilogy right from the start, like which and that kind of thing really kind of started after Lord of the Rings really hit it big, and after that, everything became a trilogy at that point. But
would Batman have not pioneered that? I didn't know if they'd be going off like a Batman model where they'd, like, the movies aren't directly connected, but you could tell that they're still using the same characters up until, at least for the first two. I always felt like, I didn't know if that was just Burton's plan, and they said, hey, you made one really good one, make another one just like it.
No, Burton originally came out only for the one movie, and then Batman was so successful that Burton originally didn't want to do a sequel, and because he had no interest in doing any sequels of any kind, and Warner Brothers had to basically, back the dump truck full of money onto his front lawn and give him like total creative freedom, which then freaked out McDonald's, and then after that they went with Joel Schumacher. But no, they had not had planned to do like a series of Batman movies. They had just planned to do the one movie. Back then, like that was just what you did. Like sequels were diminishing returns, right? They weren't that, and like the most successful ones were like the horror movie franchises where they do like these endless sequels, but each one was cheaper than the other one. But horror movies always make more than their budget anyway, so it was fine for that. But these big budget movies, it was really hard back then if you think about it. Like, sequels are, after the 80s, like sequels were becoming less and less common. I mean, you had the James Bond films were really kind of like the exception to the rule, and
because you had the benefit of, you could replace the actor and still wind up being I mean, obviously they had some of the books to work with too, but I would think Superman would have been the model for how the sequelitis did not wind up serving the brand well over time, if you kept stretching too thin.
So yeah, my understanding was with X-Men, like, they did the first movie, but I think there were hopes for a sequel because they clearly left the door open for stuff in there, like with, Wolverine going off at the end and Magneto still being alive at the end. So they'd clearly left the door open for sequels, but it wasn't like a definite thing, which is why, Singer ended up going to do Superman instead of the third movie, because he had asked Fox time and time again, are we do a third one? Are we do a third one? And Fox kept waffling. They wouldn't commit to a third one until Singer had signed on with Warner Brothers.
So I'm shamefully looking at the wiki to find some more information. And so one thing that interests me, the film was announced in mid-1997, along with a raft of other comic book adaptations, including Blade, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Daredevil. Oh my gosh, the even the weird divide even back then of, if you compare Blade and Daredevil, like, very dark, very atmospheric, very 90s kind of things. And then you had like the first Fox version of Fantastic Four, which was so, even though it was a very dumb movie, was so bright and so colorful and so like ridiculous. This is kind of that weird fork. Like, I feel like Mystery Men is this weird off-brand spot right before the Divergent splits, where it's dark but it's really funny, and it's not like, it's played 99% for laughs. And then you kind of see where the fork splits, and comic book movies either kind of get relegated to two very distinct zones, to which I think Fox's Fantastic Four kind of was the last gasp. But hey, like kind of like Superman, like, hey, maybe these movies can be, until the MCU, where it's like, until they can be bright and colorful and still retain that 60s 70s kind of energy, or atmosphere.
Well, when you think about the movies that were made during this time, up until Spider-Man, and Spider-Man was really kind of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four were really kind of outliers in that. Most of these movies, these superhero movies, seem to go out of their way to kind of like hide the fact that they're superheroes, right? Like you didn't have the bright costumes, you didn't have when they did have code names and stuff like that, they often weren't being used that frequently. In the X-Men movies, right? How often do they just call each other by their real names as opposed to calling them like Cyclops and Wolverine? And then this movie, they had actual superhero costumes, like bargain basement superhero costumes, yes. But still, like they make the point of showing them make superhero costumes, right?
Well, the fact that the Sphinx's training is like, man, that's one of the other lines that just gets me. And it's just Ben Stiller sitting at a sewing machine, being like, why are we doing this? Also, I need a thimble. Does anyone have a thimble? Like him just being like, I object to this, but also I want to be like, the idea of them making their costumes is just so ridiculously dumb that if you stop and think about, they at the time, like going back, me thinking about Daredevil, who is blind, making his own costume that's going to have that red leather like look that they're going to wind up having in the early 2000s movie, like the things that they just put a spotlight on and make you go, yeah, think about this for a second. They're going to have to make their own outfits, and they're going to do it together. And they're gonna have a good time just being pals. But the disbelief that you have to have for like, I mean, Superman always got away with it by being like, because he gets to play into it. He's like, do you like my cape? Like, or I like your cape. My mom made it for me.
Yeah.
Like, that kind of cute, sweet kind of. But that's Superman. That's why it works. But other characters, like, I mean, that's the thing that they would joke about in X-Men, where he's like, what are we supposed to be going out in? Like, what else are we going out in? Yellow spandex.
But no, it is funny because there's a mention of someone making the costumes, right? Like in Batman Forever, when Chris O'Donnell comes out in the Robin suit and he's like, where'd you get that suit? And then Alfred says, oh, I made it for him. It's like, okay, Alfred, when did you learn how to vulcanize rubber or some shit? But then in Spider-Man too, right? When Tobey Maguire is wearing the sweatshirt and the big gloves, and then next thing you know, he's wearing this professionally made suit that you don't have any idea how he made.
Man, I will admit, you're bringing it up has made me, which is funny considering how much Spider-Man is frequently talked about all the time now. Man, remembering the first Raimi movie is always so weird because it's like, it's so iconic that it just exists as like background radiation amongst all the other superhero films, and to the point where I acknowledge it exists, I don't even have to think about it. It's always been there. And so you actually mentioning that made me go back and think, oh yes, that's right. Man, those movies were such a good time until Spider-Man 3. Wow, what a good set of things those movies did.
Yeah, in fact, it wasn't until like this movie, I think, was the first movie up until Batman Begins when you actually see how the sausage is made, so to speak, as far as the costumes. Because then in Batman Begins, it shows him how he gets the suit, right? They show him building the suit and everything. I mean, it's not at a sewing machine, but it's still that same idea.
Obviously, like cartoons and animated shows had filled that void for younger audiences, but I always appreciated that this movie was trying to do stuff specifically geared towards adults. I mean, and anyone else. I don't want to say it was specifically a family movie. It was definitely what would the right term be? It's not edgy enough to be punk. It's not straight enough to be anything canon. It's just comedy. And I think the fact that they kept it in that wheelhouse instead of making anything, I feel like somehow Ben Stiller, they'd ask, are you making a superhero movie? He'd be like, well, I'm making a comedy film. Like, feels like it has that right kind of tone. Yeah. Whereas something like Spider-Man, I think you can laugh at them for a gag, them making like the joke about, hey, does anyone have a thimble? But if you have that same scene with like being done by Sam Raimi for Spider-Man, you're just absorbed and to be like, oh wow, they're actually showing him like making the suit. Oh, this is so really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, how neat. But it's the same thing. Like it should be the thing you laugh about, but that's the beauty of cinema, is depending on how you focus the camera and how you actually push the music and the setup for the scene. Like having seen him in that ridiculous outfit when he goes to fight Bonesaw, and then transitioning into like an actual superhero outfit. No, you're not going to ask, how did he make it? Right. But another property like Mystery Men can do that thing and can have that. It's almost like a jester. Like its purpose is to ask those obnoxious questions and to make you be like, okay, fine. Yes, we are allowed to laugh at it. It is okay. As opposed to in some other movies where, I mean, the idea of Alfred making the sculpted butt of a George Clooney bat suit, like just imagining him in the Batcave at night, like pouring the mold and taking the measurements of Master Bruce's behind, like it's so odd. But of course that would never happen in those movies, because that's just the way that the suspension of disbelief works. But when you pop that bubble and you make a movie like this, where it's like, why wouldn't your villain have an ornate, gaudy, like palace filled with like grotesque art, like in the actual literal sense of grotesque, like opulence to the point of like being disgusting. Like why wouldn't you do that? Like of course, like come on. Like it's just, I think it's what makes as a mirror to hold up to the kind of things that superhero movies would wind up kind of trying to gloss over a little bit in the future. I just think Mystery Men stands as this kind of funny 90s time capsule that lets you kind of go, yeah, it's okay to kind of laugh at these things. And I think short of Guardians of the Galaxy, and maybe even some of the kind of lines that they would give Tony Stark, like in the MCU later, or even Ant-Man a little bit. Oh, this has heavy Ant-Man kind of parallels, I feel like, in my brain. Like him, a Paul Rudd kind of thing. I could have seen him if they were remaking this. Paul Rudd should be a character.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Something similar to this. And I think that's why those Ant-Man movies fill that role, is so literally Marvel can be like, no, look, we don't take ourselves too seriously. Have you seen Ant-Man? Have you seen
I think the Deadpool movies also do that too, because I think the Deadpool movies, more than any others, are half serious comic book movie, half parody of comic book movies.
Oh yes, but it is most definitely skewed heavily into the rated R territory.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And that is obviously like, that is the audience they want. They definitely want the, we're looking forward with this premiere on like HBO Max or something. Like this was, I think the almost all ages kind of approach is also kind of weird, considering. Man, would Mystery Men have worked if this was rated R and they had actually done like a different kind, like Deadpool style humor?
At that time, probably not. Like now, I think so. I think it would have, but back then, and that's one of the things that when the Watchmen movie came out, which is why it failed so spectacularly, is because everybody saw it and they think, oh, superhero movie, I can take my kids to this without even looking at the rating. And so yeah, it wasn't really, Deadpool is the one that really kind of popped that bubble, was the whole R-rated superhero thing. I mean, you did have ones before that, but they weren't as open about being superhero movies, like The Crow or Darkman or Blade. But it was
Spawn.
Or Spawn, yeah.
Yeah.
Spawn would probably have been the closest one that came to skirting that edge. But really, Deadpool was the one that really kind of embraced the superhero aspect of it. So yeah, if this had been rated R and it came out in 1999, I think it would have done even worse than it actually did, because it bombed at the box office. One of the things too about this is, so Kinka Usher, this was the only movie he ever made, and the reason is because this set was like apparently a terrible experience for everybody involved. Like everybody hated being on this movie, and like,
oh no,
oh yeah, like in fact, Greg Kinnear and Ben Stiller got into such a heated argument that Stiller tried to get himself released from the movie.
Oh my gosh,
yeah, he tried to back out of the movie because and at one point, and Hank Azaria had said like a few years, like about 10 years ago, no, not I think it was it Hank Azaria or William H. Macy? One of them had Oh, yeah, Hank Azaria, 2011 interview. He said that during production, Kinka Usher declared, "I'm going back to commercials when this is done. I've had enough. I'd much rather do my cool little 1 minute shorts that I make than deal with all this nonsense."
Oh, that's sad. Oh,
Yeah, yeah. So
darn.
apparently it was a miserable experience for everybody involved on this. Like they were constantly fighting in the movie, um and yeah, nobody really liked doing this movie. And Janeane Garofalo later came out and and she was like complaining about it too. It was like how it, she had thought it would be this one thing and it ended up being something completely different. So there were arguments about like how comedic it should be, and yeah, so all of that, it's too bad. I think this movie is probably an example of probably too many people getting involved in the process. I think that's one of the risks when you have a bunch of actors, a bunch of comedians who can do improv, and you have them all working together on this film that's kind of that there's not really much of a script to begin with, and it wasn't people weren't all on the same page, unfortunately, and I think that kind of works together. And I think because there are times when the tone does seem a little bit kind of uneven. Like there are times when it's funnier than you think it should be, and times when it's not as funny as it should be.
I think that is very true, and I think that also kind of hides some of the patchwork quality of. I mean, if you decide to actually stop and think, what would Champion City, what is it really like? And you actually don't really know anything about it. The villainous crime organizations are particularly ridiculous. The only real supervillain you really get to know is Casanova. If you actually stop, it's like it's thin to the point of almost being non-existent. Like there almost is no actual background to the series except for the characters and whatever they're saying on screen. Right. Like their family history is the background you're supposed to know about. The fact that it happens to be a city they're trying to save.
Yeah.
It doesn't have it's always going to be weird because Gotham and Metropolis are always so distinctly defined by what they're kind of like. Champion City you could just rename it Jersey. And would it change much in the long run? No. And so I think you're mentioning of them having such a hard time. I'm almost seeing mentally my vision is adjusting, and I'm starting to picture the fact that so much of this feels like it's haphazardly glued together.
Yeah.
Because all they need to focus on is we just need to find the right dialogue for these characters to say. What about the rest of it? What about it? We'll get there later. In the meantime, we need a really good set of lines to play off of each other. And I could see them definitely maybe feeling like, what is the point of this? Especially for like Janeane Garofalo. To her credit, I feel like maybe they wanted her, maybe the improv, maybe there was a version of her that she was supposed to be in the role that she was like, I thought I was going to be doing something else. What they wanted me to do was this. I just decided to improv it and do my own thing. So I feel very sad that they did not, that is apparently such a disaster.
Yeah.
Outside of the box office.
Yeah. Which also was a disaster.
Yes.
But yeah, I think probably about the end of what I have to say about this movie. Do you have anything else you wanted to add about this?
No, I mean, other than I'm just glad that you were receptive to watching it. It was in my, the content that you've made, the people that you've had the very fortunate benefit of having as guests and that you've been working with alongside for lots of this content, you've seen and done so much that I sometimes feel like, if you're asked to talk about superhero content, when you were looking for guests, my initial thoughts sometimes run to things that I just happen to enjoy, but just because I enjoy it doesn't mean it's interesting to talk about. And so, it was one of those things where I was like, oh, shoot, because I think I had mentioned one or two other things. You're like, oh, we've actually covered that content already. So when this one kind of came out, it was more of a, oh, no, mystery man. He's probably either done this or he doesn't care to do it. And then you agreed. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. All right. And so it was very fortunate that I remember, I believe it was one of your previous episodes. You had mentioned which one of the content you were going to do. And someone was like, did you like it? And you were like, no, I did not like it. I did not like it. I think you said you fell asleep within the first 30 minutes. I'm trying to remember which show it was. So I was worried this would be the same thing. I was like, oh, he's very generously going to watch Mystery Men. I hope that I don't see someone on his comments say, oh, are you going to like Mystery Men? And then he types in, it was a disaster. I'll talk about it on the show with the dum-dum who asked me to watch it. So I was very glad that it wound up being a not horrible time.
No, I mean, this is not, I wouldn't go so far as to call this a bad movie. It's not a good movie, but it's not a bad movie either, right? It's somewhere between those two extremes.
It's very nostalgically safe.
Yeah, I mean, it's got its moments that are definitely enjoyable, and it's got its moments where, you just kind of like, you're just kind of like looking at your watch and wondering when it's going to be over. But it's not like watching Zack Snyder's Justice League, which was a painful experience for me.
I was so very intrigued by because I wanted to know, can you polish a turd well enough that it shines? When he was going to make the Snyder cut version, my wife and I watched about 25 minutes of it. And once it got to there's heavy-handed, and then there's like a giant hand of lead falling from space, smashing into you with some of the musical choices.
Yeah,
we just looked at each other and we were like, nah, we're good. Anything that this has to say is better left somewhere else. We're not gonna. It's like The Simpsons. It's like $100 or $1 for eternal happiness. He's like, I think I'll be happier with the dollar. I think I'll be happier with the time I relinquish from not having to watch this. So I was just very glad. I'm glad it was not a disaster. That it was just a fun thing to kind of get through. And I think as a piece of cinema history, it exists. It didn't really need to make a bigger mark other than, it brought people a few laughs. And hey, if you find it on Netflix.
I mean, especially for the time that this came out in, I mean, it's actually a really good superhero movie if you're looking at that era of superhero movies, because this is about the same time as Blade. I think Blade also came out, or maybe Blade came out a year earlier than this. But this is before X-Men. This is before Spider-Man. I mean, the contemporaries of Mystery Men are like Spawn, Batman and Robin, Steel, and that's about it. So and when you compare it up against those movies, it's pretty damn good.
Yeah. No, I think we have exhausted the well of things to say about Mystery Men, which I think in terms of content is almost about as long as the movie itself.
Yeah.
Which it's a very good thing to its credit. Other than, hey, we went through this whole thing without really having to talk about Paul Rubens. Awesome. I'm very glad.
Yeah. I think the less said about Paul Rubens these days is probably for the best.
Indeed.
Anyway, Michael, can tell people where they can find you. Anything you want to promote before we close up?
Sure. So, I mean, I wish I would say tongue-tied. We made our website, but we have not. We have basically we've been slowly transferring all our old material over to the website from SoundCloud, because at the time SoundCloud was the only thing that could really host us for the unlimited data. So if you just Google KMP Podcast and SoundCloud, you can find our accurate, current, up-to-date listing of all our content. We also just have kmpodcast.com, which things are slowly being pushed over to. The last episode that we kind of talked about was the What If series for all the Marvel content.
Oh, okay,
which was fun. And we're gonna have it's like a 3-hour long, we watched the Star Wars Vision series, and it was the happiest we have ever been talking about anything in so long. So keep your eyes peeled for that. If you either go to our SoundCloud or just Google us and just go to kmpodcast.com. Once that drops, that is pretty much it's just pure joy. So I'm very glad once that one drops. Everything else we've been talking about is usually, sometimes we're lucky to have guests. We had a previous episode back from about 3 months ago where we looked at Stephen King. It was my friend MK and my friend BJ, and we decided that we wanted to actually interrogate the Dr. Sleep movie. So our content genres span from from film, sometimes horror films, usually, because that's what BJ really likes doing, and usually anime, video games. And it's very generic content. Again, we're very informal, so any press we get with other people, we're very happy to have. If other people let us be guests on their show, like you're doing, or guests on our show. So if we do anything that you enjoy, please tell us. You'd be surprised when your viewing audience is probably in the 20s. Any feedback is very well felt.
Yeah.
And we will bend over backwards to make content if we think that someone actually wants to do it. So you can find us on SoundCloud, you can find our website, either way. But we're very appreciative of you and actually the content you make, because your Japan on Film content for, I feel like, the past year is just basically cranked to 11.
Oh, thank you.
I feel like, if I may, because you're very kind, and I definitely want, because I'm going to wind up reposting this once the episode comes out. So if no one knows who you are, I am always extremely appreciative that you've tongue-tied so much today, that you've actually tried to cover a kind of profile of Japanese cinema that goes beyond tropism. Like, I love samurai film, I love anime, but to actually, hold on. Because I want to, as I say this and I talk out loud too much, I start to literally lose my own brain. I want to actually get the episode that you did, because it's one of my favorite movies, Night and Fog.
Oh yeah,
I love Night and Fog so much. The fact that you wound up being able to do that episode, and that other people can listen to it and find out that Night and Fog even exists, and they can get an insight into even though it's from I believe the 60s.
1960.
That even you can look at cinema then and get a really interesting glimpse into the kind of things that are important to Japanese politics in the present is extremely valuable from podcasters. And so I am appreciative of all the content that you make, and that you wind up trying to find stuff that is genuinely interesting, but also insightful for the medium, so that people kind of can come away from it not just being like, Japanese films must be martial arts or samurai, or a Tokyo Story, or things like that. So I love your content. I'm glad you make those things, and I'm glad if anyone listens to my stuff on my Facebook when I repost this link, please visit Japan on Film, watch his stuff, listen to it. It's wonderful. I love it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've actually got we're actually having to take a break from before the next season, just because I just haven't had enough time to get stuff done. So we're probably not going to have any new episodes of that until probably after the new year, unfortunately.
But if it is anyone's first time discovering it, though, I mean, you've got like over 50 episodes. That's a lot of stuff to keep you busy. Until you wind up having more content.
Yeah. But yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the kind words about that. And yeah, that's something I want to do both with this show and with that show, is to, not only talk about the stuff because everybody knows about Seven Samurai, everybody knows about, Avengers, but people don't know about Mystery Men. People don't know about Night and Fog in Japan. So it's interesting to go and look at those things as well, I think, as opposed to just talking about the ones that everybody's familiar with.
Yes. Well, thank you for allowing me to have been a guest on your content yet again.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Anytime. Thanks for coming on. As for us, you can find us at superherocinephiles.com. Super Cinema Pod is the Instagram and Twitter handles. And if you want to join our Facebook group, it's just type in Superhero Cinephiles and it should pop right up. Please make sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Anytime you write a review, that helps more people find the show, let people know about it. And if you're interested in being on the show, superherocinephiles.com, there's a contact form on there. Just fill that out and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. You have been listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Super Cinema Pod. Join our Facebook group by searching for Superhero Cinephiles, where you can interact with us and other superhero fans. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a regular supporter at Patreon or make a one-time donation through PayPal, both of which can be found at our website, superherocinephiles.com. If you buy or rent any movies through the Amazon links at our site, it helps support the show. Please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, Good night. Good evening. God bless.